I'll talk a little bit about CRL's newspaper site licensing, which has been a very active program lately. CRL's licensing focus is very much a continuation of what CRL has historically, the continuation of the historical collection development priorities of CRL. It focuses on primary sources like news, law and government, legal information. The foreign official gazettes are a big part of CRL's collections, and foreign state documents is another big part of CRL's collections. And also economic and population data. The census is on microform, and the central bank reports are important parts of the CRL print and microform holdings. We are mimicking these or continuing these in the licensing realm. Our focus in licensing is, again, to ensure the long-term accessibility and integrity of primary source research materials that otherwise would not be preserved or would not remain accessible for the longer term, so at-risk materials. What a couple of the developments lately that have made are dealing with news site licensing more urgent and important are some of the changing realities about in the world of the access to news back files. We're seeing now the demise of the microform and print access model, kind of a slow death, but a certain death nonetheless. We're seeing that in the form of reductions, very, very continual and deep reductions in or decline in interlibrary loan and document delivery requests for these kinds of materials. We're also seeing problematic terms introduced by the vendors of news microforms. Some of the vendors of the commercial news microforms are now prohibiting interlibrary loan of the microforms, and so that really makes the purchase of newspaper back files on microfilms a non-starter, at least for CRL, that's built on sharing of collections. We also have major national libraries moving away from microfilm. The British Library and Bibliothèque Nationale de France have discontinued microfilming in favor of digitization of collections. The Library of Congress is introducing digitization of newspapers in its overseas operations in place of microfilm, and so those things will get in the way of news content being made available to people. We're also seeing the second thing is the aggregator model is beginning to show its age. The page image files of news of major newspapers like the New York Times, the Wall Street Journals, and them that are available through vendors like or aggregators like Redex and Gale are covering less and less of the total output of those news organizations now. Most of the output of those news organizations now is the web, and there's a great deal more on the web that obviously doesn't come through when you microfilm the pages, and even when you digitize the pages, the print edition. We're also seeing the limitations of web archiving that seem to have some promise. The harvesting of web pages seemed to have some promise for a while there, but we found when you really look at what's being archived in the way of news sites, the archiving does not go very deep, and there's really not much integrity to it. We're also seeing the foundering or the very, very limited success that national libraries are having with legal deposit of electronic newspapers. There's again, most of that is confined to page image PDFs rather than the actual harvesting of the deep news sites, which are very, very difficult to crawl with existing technology. So what we're looking at is some basically the transition from microfilm and print to electronic. How are we dealing with it? Well, site licensing is part of CRL's approach to it. We're in the process. We've had some success in Ann Okerson. We'll talk a little bit more about that. We've had some success on negotiating site licenses for U.S. and Canada for certain newspapers, and this is the licensing of access to web content, websites that are behind the paywall. We are seeing more and more of websites, or more and more news online sites, even in the developing world, even in the global south, go behind the paywalls as news organizations struggle to sustain their reporting that they're doing and sustain their coverage. Our objectives in site licensing is, number one, global coverage. We're trying to, since site licensors are expensive, we're trying to cover as much of the globe as we can. We're looking at the major news organizations. Second factor, what we're looking for is deep evidence-based reporting. There's not a whole lot of use in our trying to collect all the tabloid news sites and the content from those, or hyper-local news at this stage. It's probably somebody should keep that, but it may be a bit difficult to do, or a bit beyond our remit at this stage. Also, we're looking at sites that have high functionality and robust tools. With the growth of digital humanities and the text and data mining and computer-assisted analysis of large bodies of text, scholars have come to expect high functionality and robust tools, and so just kind of page image, or even just kind of page image and static content is not really satisfying that much. And then most of all, we're looking for the likelihood of persistence, that we're looking at sites that the news organizations that are likely to continue to produce high quality evidence-based reporting, continue to support high functionality, robust tools, and continue to cover as much of the world's events as possible. That's led to our choosing our targets. We have actually worked quite intensively on this for the last several years, and it's been quite a labor-intensive process. The news organizations are different kinds of organizations than the electronic journal publishers like Elsevier and Springer and Wiley. News organizations are organizations for whom academia is not their first audience. It's not their primary market. So there's been this has been quite slow and deliberative. The targets so far, the New York Times, obviously we have the national site license for the New York Times Online, and through that there are about over 200 libraries that subscribe to the New York Times Online through CRL. The Wall Street Journal is second one, and Washington Post is in the works. These are other evidence-based news organizations that have some credibility in global reporting. In the pipeline, and not certain at all, are things like, except Frankfurter Allgemeine Zeitung, the major German newspaper that's been around, I think, several centuries, and has very high quality financial reporting on the EU, is something we have an offer for now that's been negotiated. And then two newspapers in our sites are El País, which covers a great deal of Latin America and Spain and Portugal, and also the Latin American diaspora. And then the South China Morning Post, which is the major English language news, independent news organization from China. So that's a little bit in the way of context of what our site licensing effort has, what's shaped our site licensing effort. I'd like Ann Okerson to talk a little bit about her experience in negotiating these, and what Ann will say will give you a little sense of why these the site licenses in terms of these are in some cases problematic, and in some cases just plain strange. Ann, I think you're unmuted.
Hello, thank you, Bernie. This is CRL's East Coast office. Can you all hear me?
Yes.
Okay, just checking. Can we have the next slide, please? Okay, I am going to describe for you all, for us all, 3 use cases of CRL site licensing for current newspapers. So next slide, please. Yeah, Bernie has talked a little bit about CRL's goals and challenges, And I think we've all learned that educational site licenses for current daily newspapers are fairly new, and they're really quite experimental. We became accustomed with the advent of the web to getting all the current articles from newspapers, or many of them, for free. We just follow the link and all would be well. And then newspapers started realizing that, A, they had some economic and financial issues that were bothering them, and they needed to monetize some of this income. So we started seeing paywalls. The New York Times offered, I think, 10 articles a month for free, and so on. And now this, I think, is heading towards a sophistication, well, the beginning of a sophistication in providing educational site licenses. We're at the trailhead of that. As Bernie said, newspaper licenses don't follow familiar scholarly licensing models, such as journals, databases, and books. They just don't. And there are various reasons for this. I'm going to name just two. One is the historic practice of newspapers in marketing directly to individuals. This is something that's mostly not true in scholarly publishing, where many or most or often all of these subscribers are educational institutions. So the practice is evolving differently. The other thing is, I think that in news, a very high value is placed on immediacy. This is true also of the financial services. News is up to the hour, up to the minute. It changes, and it's added to and embellished all the time, much more so even than we see in the STM literature. As Bernie has also said, we've developed a kind of approach, which I'm going to call Reach for the Top, and I'm going to describe three of those top newspapers. Next slide. Thank you. I think most of you on this call probably know about CRL's relationship with the New York Times, but I'm going to talk about it a little bit as a refresher so that you get a sense of what I think perhaps the most robust electronic licensing, newspaper licensing program, at least in this country, is about. And various of our efforts are sort of built using this as a kind of example in many ways. So this is not our grandparents' New York Times. It's a living, breathing, multimedia enterprise. It constantly changes. You can listen to audio. You can watch video. It is a very rich resource compared to anything that we've seen in the past and compared to our other channels, like, let's say, Factiva or Kirkliff Historic Newspapers or whatever. The New York Times has been thinking about educational site licenses throughout this decade. And they were particularly interested, I think, in attracting students and building good news habits in the student population. We announced our offer in winter, spring 2014, so nearly 5 years ago. And the pricing for each institution, which I know many of us and you don't like very well, is that it's customized for every school, and it's based on that school's FTE and faculty headcount. And the aim of this is to protect the New York Times' current subscriber revenue. The New York Times does have a very large installed base in this country, particularly in the Northeast region, and they don't want to erode or undermine that. In fact, I'm going to say they can't really afford to do that. So they're very, very careful about that. We have, however, seen some relaxing of those concerns over the last year in a couple of ways. One is that our quotes for at least smaller schools away from the Northeast subscriber base are coming in a little bit lower than they used to. And the good news for every subscriber right now is that our renewals increases for the past year have been at something between 0 more often to 2% less often increase. So that's all really good news. Folks say that the New York Times educational site license seems expensive. In the aggregate, it can be for big schools, but it is so much cheaper than the $200 and on up for individual subscribers. Next slide. Yeah, so as you probably know, the access goes like this. Each school that joins specifies the initial authorization means of users. This can be via domain or IP. And then users go through that domain or IP and they register individually to secure access. And again, this is based on knowing your subscribers and on advertising requirements and practices in order to secure revenue for the newspapers. And then subsequently, individuals access through their own accounts. Students are asked when they will graduate. They're given access until then, so they don't have to re-up every year. And the rest of us authorize ourselves annually. A very, very special thing about the New York Times is that they have made a huge investment in digitizing and providing access to all site license subscribers back to issue number 1 in 1850 with full searching capabilities. I don't know any other newspaper that's done this. Many have partners and channels with Gale or ProQuest, but the New York Times has done this, and while we do not yet have a perpetual access arrangement, everyone in the license can use the Times back to 1850. So that is pretty amazing, I think, and very desirable. Next slide, please. CRL makes its lowest pricing offer available not just to our members, but also to any other North American consortial partners who are members of ICALC. We want to bring more readers to quality newspapers to this offer to keep our prices and offers down, and to develop a long-term partnership in which we have sufficient influence that we can be the camel that puts its nose under the tent of things like preservation and perpetual access. Those are really our bigger goals. So we handle quotes, we consolidate orders, renewals, we pay the New York Times a single invoice, we collect money from our subscribers, our partners, and CRL members do get the very best price because to all the others, we do charge cost recovery. And this has worked, this partnership has worked quite well. Next slide. Okay, so where are we today with the New York Times? We have 18 or more participating consortia with CRL in North America. As of April 1st, there are licenses for 1.9 million FTE in North America. FTE is FTE, but there are actually more eyeballs than that because not every student is a full-time student. Also, as of April 1st, we're estimating our revenue to the New York Times for 2019 as $2.6 million, which is a very nice kind of amount of money and growing. But I'm saying these are estimated because Francis Alba at CRL and I are working on the July 1st renewals, so we don't have all the numbers in yet. The offer has, in fact, evolved well, and we're working to improve it in spite of quite a lot of staff turnover at the New York Times. Interesting, this newspaper and others are reorganizing themselves, reinventing themselves. Staff take buyout offers, people come and go. But the New York Times has managed the transitions pretty well, and I think we've helped them quite a lot with that. Okay, next slide. I'd like to talk about the Washington Post for a minute. This is in process. I've been saying for 2 months. It's coming soon. They have only been in the academic market since sometime in 2018, and before that appeared to have little interest in academia. The model for the Washington Post is going to resemble the New York Times model in a number of ways. The pricing will be based on FTE and possibly faculty headcount. There will be custom quotes. We didn't want to go this way. They didn't either. But once they had a better sense of the 4,000 higher ed institutions in the U.S. and their diversity, they felt they could not come up with a common rate card for everyone. Their aim actually isn't to protect subscriber revenue, but it's to grow subscriber revenue because they don't have the install base that the New York Times does. And the CRL workflow will be, I think, fairly similar to how we do it with the New York Times. There are two ways in which the New York Times significantly differs from the Washington Post. One is that the Washington Post will limit back files access to like 4 years, and then they'll send you to other channels like ProQuest, historical newspapers. The other thing is that there will be two types of licenses. One will be for on-site campus access only. That will be via IP. It will be relatively inexpensive, or there will be the full access kind of arrangement you get with the New York Times. So that will be a difference. And then my final slide, please. Yeah. I'd like to talk for a second about the Frankfurter Allgemeine Zeitung, though there's much more to be said. We started working under the Global Collections Initiative of CRL. Our original aim was to partner with the Canadian, the German, and the UK consortium to explore foreign newspaper partnerships and go beyond that. This has modified somewhat, and we have been able to put an offer on the table for CRL members within the last month. I could talk for another 15 minutes about why the others haven't been able to be brought along, but I think that's a different subject. The offer from the FAZ is imperfect, but it has improved a great deal over the last couple of years that we've been talking and talking and talking. It's provided us, I think, with a significant learning experience to obstacles and opportunities in international licensing, and I think it positions us well to tackle future foreign newspaper forays. So thank you very much, and I think we're now ready for some discussion and questions.
Great. We have a question already. This is Bernie Riley again at CRL about the privacy issue, that the fact that these newspaper deals often require users to create accounts to get any access at all through the license, which is very different from most library license resources. And does CRL have any interest in advocating for better protection of our privacy, user privacy in the Wall Street Journal deal? We do, but I think there are limits to the to what we can accomplish in the way of changing the privacy approaches of these organizations. It was interesting that the New York Times has published now has started publishing a series on their handling of user information and privacy. That's disclosure of their privacy and policy and their practices with regard to user data, but it's not a change in policy, but if it's quite illuminating. I think with these kind of resources that have huge user bases they're using, or that have potentially huge user bases, that they're using the trade in user information, user data, as a way to keep costs down. It used to be advertising was the main revenue stream for newspapers, news reporting, but that's been eroded quite a bit, and so the ability to capture and use data about what people are using, what the users are looking at, has become a real necessary thing in the news world, unfortunately. But with the Times, at least, they're pretty transparent about what they do capture and how they use it. Okay, let me see. All right, Boaz has posted a quote from the New York Times. They're reporting their disclosures on privacy. It's on the chat screen. He said that from the sharing with other third party, they will not sell, rent, swap, or authorize any third party except their service providers to use your email address without your permission. Nothing in this privacy policy is intended to restrict our use, namely New York Times use or sharing of aggregated or de-identified information in any way, and that's common with all publishers, I think. Yeah, we will update, and someone asked, will CRL update us in May about whether any further changes will be made to the FAZ license? Because some people can't agree with it as it is due to the way the indemnification clause is written. Ann, do you want to take a crack at that?
The FAZ license that we now have is the product of a couple of years of work. I don't anticipate that it will change by May. I think we will have to show that there is interest, at least a lot of interest and some uptake before we have any more leverage. We did get things that we didn't initially have. We got some interlibrary loan, we got some course room, course packet use and things like that, which is all good. But the FAZ reminds us that this agreement that you've seen is an agreement with CRL. It's not an agreement necessarily with the individual institutions, or it is at some remove. But yeah, I think where we are now is where we are for the next while through the year. And we wish it could have been better. Inside CRL, we've thrashed through this any number of times, and we came to a place where we said, is this now good enough? Is it the best we can do for now that we can put it out as a flyer to CRL members? So that's where we are.
Yeah, and we are interested in user comments. Julie pointed out that it's a little bit confusing that member comments on this offer are being solicited through May 3rd. If no further negotiation is anticipated, this will get negotiated every year, but knowing that what the issues are, you're letting us know what the issues are will help us in those negotiations. If we can say to the Frankfurter Allgemeine and Zeitung people, listen, people are not buying into this because of the indemnification clause, then that could help. So please let us know if that's an issue for you folks, and be as precise as you can about that as well. Jeff Koskoff pointed out that the...
Also, I was going to say that in a number of cases we come up against foreign law and foreign practice and expectations, and those are pretty hard to work around. We kind of got 2/3 of the way to where we wanted to be, so that's some kind of progress. It's not perfect.
Yeah, we try to stay as close as we can to the NERL license terms, but it's these, as Ann pointed out earlier, these vendors are not library-facing vendors. Essentially, they're corporate-facing vendors and individual-facing vendors and Wall Street-facing vendors, and so they some of the things that we want are just foreign, very foreign to them. Do we have time for any more questions, or we have? Okay. Oh, and is there any interest in the Chicago Tribune? Somebody asked. That would be a good question. That is a good question.
I did get in touch with them about half a year ago, and even if we're interested, they weren't.
Well, they're kind of in turmoil.
We can circle back around to that.
They're kind of in turmoil, and it is really a rag, but but it's I can understand there being interest in it, but we'll keep at it. Great. So we have the indemnification clause on the Frankfurter Allgemeine Zeitung as an issue, the privacy or the user information, the email sign up as an issue with the Wall Street Journal and with New York Times, and also that the Wall Street Journal wants even more than just an email address from people. Isn't it like Rupert Murdoch to want more? So, good. Thanks for the question. Thanks for your interest.